This is episode 33 of the Creator God Theory of the Atonement. I've titled it Outcome Number 1, Divine Love, with the subtitle, The Atonement Vortex and the Meaning of Christ-like Love, Part 7. In our last episode, we introduced Part 2 of The Way Out with this question: how should we understand love and hate? Our answer was this: love is relational, not intrinsically good. Hate is relational, not intrinsically evil. Then we ended the episode by introducing the 3 principles that will provide the philosophical foundation for a relational understanding of love and hate. First, the teeter-totter principle, which asks the question, how are love and hate related? Second, the two-sided coin principle, which answers the question, why do love and hate rise and fall together? And lastly, the rubber band principle, which asks, what determines the proper limits of love and hate? Together, these 3 principles and their answers to these questions will provide the philosophical foundation for replacing the inherited intrinsic understanding of love and hate with an objective relational understanding. Let us begin then with the first, the teeter-totter principle, where we will discover that love and hate are fundamentally different from opposing realities, such as good and evil, right and wrong, or life and death. Rather than standing opposed to one another, love and hate are inseparable relational responses. As one rises, the other falls, and as one falls, the other rises. This is what we mean when we say that love and hate rise and fall together. They work in concert with one another like a teeter-totter, with love on one end and hate on the other. The first step in understanding why love and hate function like a teeter-totter is to understand where they fit within the objective view of value that we introduced back in episode 30. At that time, our purpose was to explain where values come from. As illustrated here, we trace their origin from reality to life, to the needs or requirements of life, to values, and ultimately to the value-directed actions and behaviors that produce either life-advancing or life-diminishing outcomes. For our present purposes, however, there are several implications of this model that we did not need to make explicit at the time, but which now become extremely important for understanding why love and hate function like the 2 ends of a teeter-totter. First, notice something fundamental about every form of life represented here. Life is conditional. Plants, mice, deer, wolves, and human beings are very different forms of life, but none can live and flourish under just any conditions whatsoever. Each possesses a particular identity, and arising from that identity are particular conditions that must be satisfied if that life is to be sustained and advanced. Those conditions give rise to what we have called the needs or requirements of life. And this leads to a second important implication. Life is the objective standard of value. Something does not become objectively valuable merely because it exists, nor because someone desires it, chooses it, or declares it valuable. Rather, its objective value is determined by its relationship to life. More specifically, life's requirements provide the objective criteria of value. In other words, life supplies the standard, while the particular requirements arising from life supply the criteria by which things are evaluated in relation to that standard. Those things that satisfy, sustain, protect, or advance the requirements of life constitute values. Conversely, those things that frustrate, damage, diminish, or destroy those requirements constitute disvalues. And notice the relational nature of both concepts. Something is not a value or disvalue simply in and of itself. It is a value or disvalue in relation to a particular living organism and the requirements of its life. And that brings us to one final implication that we will need going forward: the distinction between good and bad. As we saw in episode 30, value-directed actions and behaviors ultimately prove either successful or unsuccessful according to the outcomes they produce. When those outcomes satisfy or advance the requirements of life, they are life-advancing and therefore good. When those outcomes frustrate or diminish the requirements of life, they are life-diminishing and therefore bad. So at this objective level, good and bad are no more detached from life than value and disvalue are. What is good or bad is determined by its relationship to life and the requirements arising from life. We can therefore summarize this objective view with three important conclusions. Life is conditional. Life is the objective standard of value, and life's requirements provide the objective criteria by which values and disvalues, and ultimately good and bad, are determined. None of this changes the objective view we introduced earlier. It simply makes explicit several implications of that view that will become essential to what follows, and more specifically, to understanding why love and hate function like the two ends of a teeter-totter. And now notice something rather remarkable about this entire diagram. We have accounted for reality, life needs, values, and disvalues, value-directed actions and behaviors, and good and bad outcomes. Yet love and hate are nowhere to be found. That raises an important question. If values arise from life and its requirements, and good and bad are likewise determined by their relationship to life, when do love and hate enter the picture? Where do they come from? And what exactly is their relationship to value, good and bad? To answer those questions, we must now introduce something that this objective view has not yet required us to distinguish: moral agency, and with it, fallibility. And this brings us to what I will call the moral threshold. Up to this point, everything in our objective view has been grounded in the requirements of life itself. Reality gives rise to life. Life gives rise to needs. Those needs give rise to values and disvalues, which provide the objective basis for distinguishing good from bad. But something fundamentally changes when we cross this moral threshold. With the introduction of agency and fallibility, we enter an entirely new moral environment, one in which what is objectively valuable and what a particular person perceives to be valuable need not be the same thing. And that means, for the first time, the objective standard of value itself becomes an issue, not in reality, but within the mind and choices of the moral agent. Will life remain the objective standard of value, or will love, pleasure, or some other standard be substituted in its place, or will no standard be consciously applied at all? Whatever the answer, once agency and fallibility enter the picture, moral valuing begins. The question is no longer simply what is objectively valuable. The moral agent must now perceive and evaluate the world around him. What is perceived to be valuable? And how valuable is it perceived to be? And those perceptions and evaluations do not remain isolated. Over time, they begin forming what we might call an emerging personal hierarchy of values, a personal ordering of what matters more, what matters less, and what does not matter at all. Within that developing hierarchy, things are increasingly perceived in relation to the individual. Is this for me or against me? What is perceived as for me produces varying degrees of attraction. What is perceived as against me produces varying degrees of aversion. And at their more elementary levels, those attractions and aversions manifest themselves as likes and dislikes. But as those values become more important, as they move higher within one's personal hierarchy of values, those orientations deepen. Likes and dislikes deepen into love and hate, and this is where love and hate finally enter the picture. They do not appear before the moral threshold as objective determinants of what is valuable, good, or bad. They appear after the moral threshold as deepening moral orientations toward one's emerging personal hierarchy of values. And that distinction is crucial. Love and hate do not determine what is objectively valuable. They arise in response to what the moral agent has come to value. In other words, love and hate take center stage only after we enter the personal, moral environment created by agency and fallibility. And I want to stop here for a moment, because where love and hate are located within this sequence makes all the difference in the world to how we understand them. Notice again where they appear. Love and hate do not appear before the moral threshold. They appear after it. They do not arise directly from reality, life, the requirements of life, or the objective values and disvalues arising from those requirements. They arise only after the moral agent enters the picture, after objective value has become the object of personal perception, evaluation, ranking, and response. Put simply, love and hate arise on the personal side of the moral threshold, not on the objective side. They are responses to value, not sources or determinants of value. And now, with this next illustration, we can see more clearly why that distinction matters so much. On the left, we still have the objective ontology of value. What is objectively good and bad? But after crossing the moral threshold of agency and fallibility, we now have love and hate as personal moral responses to that objective good and bad. And this gives us the important distinction shown at the bottom of our illustration. Love and hate do not belong to the objective ontology of value. They belong to the personal moral response to value. And once we arrange the relationship this way, something important becomes immediately apparent. Once we cross the moral threshold of agency and fallibility, all four responses become possible. A moral agent can love what is objectively good, but that same moral agent can also hate what is objectively good. Likewise, a moral agent can hate what is objectively bad, but can also love what is objectively bad. Agency and fallibility account for all four possibilities, and that leads to an extremely important conclusion. Love or hate by itself tells us nothing about whether its object is objectively good or bad. Nonetheless, love and hate certainly tell us something. They tell us something about the moral agent. They reveal the moral agent's orientation toward what he or she has come to value. But because that personal hierarchy of values lies downstream of agency and fallibility, love and hate cannot, by themselves, establish whether that hierarchy is objectively aligned with the requirements of life. And once we recognize that, the inherited equations, love equals good and hate equals evil, can no longer simply be assumed. Love is not good merely because it is love. Hate is not evil merely because it is hate. To determine their objective and moral significance, we must look beyond the response itself to what is being loved or hated, why it is being loved or hated, and how that object ultimately relates to life and its objective requirements. And this is why locating love and hate after the moral threshold changes our understanding of them so dramatically. Love and hate are not standards by which value is determined. They are relational responses, arising from a fallible moral agent's hierarchy of values. Or put another way, love and hate reveal what we value. They do not determine whether what we value is objectively valuable. And this leads us to one final observation before moving forward. These four possible responses do not stand independently of one another. Notice how naturally they organize themselves into two opposing pairs. We can love the good and hate the bad, or we can hate the good and love the bad. Interestingly, Scripture itself frequently speaks of love and hate in just such paired terms. The prophet Amos commands us to hate the evil and love the good, while the psalmist declares, "O ye that love the Lord, hate evil." So love and hate are not merely two unrelated responses sitting side by side. Scripture itself places them together as corresponding responses toward opposing objects of value. Love toward one side is accompanied by hate toward the other. And that raises an important question. Is this pairing merely incidental, or is there something fundamental about the relationship between love and hate themselves? That is what the teeter-totter principle will help us understand. But before we can use the teeter-totter principle to explain how love and hate are related, we first need to understand the model itself, because love and hate are not operating in isolation. They are part of a larger relationship between the mind and inner heart. So let us begin with the teeter-totter principle, how the mind and inner heart work together. For those listening by audio, we have placed a simple teeter-totter on the screen as our working model, and over the next few moments, we are going to build out that model, one part at a time. But before we begin building out our teeter-totter model, there is one important distinction we need to keep clearly in mind. Although much of what we will be illustrating concerns the responses of the inner heart, the inner heart does not operate independently of the mind. The two work together. First, there is the mind. The mind is associated with our thoughts and evaluations, with thinking about and evaluating what we perceive and experience. Second, there is the inner heart. The inner heart is associated with our feelings and responses, with how we feel and respond to those thoughts and evaluations. In other words, the mind thinks and evaluates. The inner heart feels and responds to those thoughts and evaluations. We will have much more to say about that relationship shortly, but for now, that basic distinction is all we need. With that distinction in mind, let us begin building out our teeter-totter model. There are four basic parts of the illustration that we need to understand. First is the stand upon which the teeter-totter rests and pivots. The stand represents the orientation, the particular orientation of the human soul that we are examining, and answers the question, what are we oriented toward? By orientation, we simply mean whatever end, value, or outcome the human soul is presently directed toward or seeking. That orientation might be winning a game, getting a job, worshiping God, or ultimately seeking eternal life. For purposes of our model, the stand represents the particular orientation presently in view. Second are the two seats, one at each end of the teeter-totter. The seats represent paired responses and answer the question, what are the possible paired responses? Those paired responses will change depending upon the particular orientation we are examining. For example, they might take the form of cheering and booing at a sporting event, joy and sorrow over gaining or losing employment, or love and hate in response to perceived values and disvalues. And importantly, paired does not mean simultaneous. We call them paired because they are corresponding potential responses related to the same underlying orientation. At any particular moment, the inner heart is responding to the thought or evaluation presently before the mind. For the response to change direction, the thought or evaluation must first change. Third, a teeter-totter moves in two directions, up and down. In our model, those movements represent two relational directions, toward and away from or against. We see this constantly in everyday life. For example, we may move towards someone we perceive as welcome, away from someone we perceive as unwelcome, or actively against someone we perceive as threatening. And these relational directions can take different forms and degrees of intensity. Moving toward may mean simply drawing closer to something or someone, or at greater intensity, actively pursuing or embracing it. Moving in the other direction may mean simply moving away from something or someone, or at greater intensity, actively moving against it. And those differing degrees of intensity bring us to the fourth and final part of our model, the intensity scale. The intensity scale shown here, extending in both directions from the center, represents corresponding intensity and answers the question, how strongly are we oriented? At the center of the scale is zero, the neutral point. At zero, there is no meaningful movement in either relational direction, because whatever is being considered is perceived as having no meaningful bearing upon the orientation. In terms of the inner heart's response, this is the point of indifference. But as we move away from zero in either direction, the intensity increases. The farther we move in the toward direction, the greater the intensity of attraction, and the farther we move in the away from or against direction, the greater the intensity of aversion. We call this corresponding intensity because the strength of the underlying orientation is reflected in how intensely the inner heart is prepared to respond in either direction across a variety of situations. In other words, the underlying orientation supplies the intensity from which those responses arise depending upon the particular thought, evaluation, and situation. We can see this by returning to our earlier example. Someone perceived as welcome might draw us toward them with an intensity of, say, 75. Someone perceived as unwelcome might move us away from them with an intensity of 40, while someone perceived as seriously threatening might produce a much stronger response against them, perhaps 80 or even 100. So our teeter-totter model consists of four basic parts. The stand represents the orientation. The seats represent the paired responses. Up and down represent the two directions, toward and away from or against. And the scale represents corresponding intensity. And this teeter-totter model can serve as a template for whatever orientation of the human soul we happen to be examining. So for clarity's sake, let's use winning the game as our orientation and see how the model plays out. First, into our orientation box, we place winning the game. Then, in place of our two seats, we place our paired responses, cheers and boos. When something advances winning, we move toward it, we cheer. When something undermines winning, we move away from or against it, we boo. Now suppose the intensity of our orientation toward winning is, say, 60. We would generally expect our cheers and boos to reflect that same underlying level of orientation, more or less depending upon the particular play, evaluation, and circumstances. And at the center is our neutral point. When something has no perceived bearing on winning, There is no movement in either direction. We remain neutral or indifferent. So, a touchdown for our team advances winning. We cheer. A bad call against our team undermines winning. We boo. And something having no bearing on the outcome, indifference. Different events, different responses, but one underlying orientation, supplying the intensity for those responses. So what we are doing here is proceeding from the simple and familiar to the more significant and consequential. Cheers and boos have given us an easy way to see the basic workings of the teeter-totter principle. One underlying orientation, paired responses, two relational directions, and corresponding intensity. In our next episode, we will take that same model and apply it first to joy and sorrow, and then ultimately to love and hate. And as we move through these increasingly meaningful responses, I think you will begin to see why we started with something as simple as cheers and boos. By the time we finally place love and hate onto the two seats of our teeter-totter, we will not be introducing a new principle at all. We will simply be recognizing the same principle at work in a far more consequential pair of responses. And in doing so, we will finally be in a position to answer the question that started this entire investigation. How are love and hate related?